Guy Cotter, a longtime friend of both Hall's and Harris's, happened to be a few miles from Everest Base Camp on the afternoon of May 10th, where he was guiding an expedition on Pomori, and had been monitoring Hall's radio transmissions throughout the day. At 2:15 p.m., he talked to Hall on the summit, and everything sounded fine. At 4:30, however, Hall called down to say that Doug was out of oxygen and unable to move. "I need a bottle of gas," Hall pleaded in a desperate, breathless voice to anyone on the mountain who might be listening. "Somebody please. I'm begging you." Cotter grew very alarmed. At 4:53, he got on the radio and strongly urged Hall to descend to the south summit. "The call was mostly to convince him to come down and get some gas," says Cotter, "because we knew he wasn't going to be able to do anything for Doug without it. Rob said he could get himself down okay, but not with Doug." But 40 minutes later, Hall was still with Hansen atop the Hillary step, going nowhere. During radio calls from Hall at 5:36, and again at 5:57, Cotter implored his mate to leave Hansen and come down alone. "I know I sound like the bastard for telling Rob to abandon his client," confessed Cotter, but by then it was obvious that leaving Doug was his only choice. Hall, however, wouldn't consider going down without Hansen. There was no further word from Hall until the middle of the night. At 2:46 a.m., Cotter woke up in his tent below Pomori to hear a long, broken transmission, probably unintended. Hall had been wearing a remote microphone clipped to the shoulder strap of his backpack, which was occasionally keyed on by mistake. "In this instance," says Cotter, "I suspect Rob didn't even know he was transmitting. I could hear someone yelling. It might have been Rob, but I couldn't be sure because the wind was so loud in the background. But he was saying something like, 'Keep moving, keep going,' presumably to Doug, urging him on." If this was indeed the case, it meant that in the wee hours of the morning, Hall and Hansen, perhaps accompanied by Harris, were still struggling from the Hillary step toward the south summit through the gale. And if so, it also meant that it had taken them more than 10 hours to move down a stretch of ridge that was typically covered by descending climbers in less than half an hour. Of course, this is highly speculative. All that is certain is that Hall called down at 5:57 p.m. At that point, he and Hansen were still on the step. And at 4:43 on the morning of May 11th, when he next spoke to base camp, he had descended to the south summit. And at that point, neither Hansen nor Harris was with him. In a series of transmissions over the next 2 hours, Rob sounded disturbingly confused and irrational. During the call at 4:43 a.m., he told Caroline McKenzie, our base camp doctor, that his legs no longer worked and that he was too clumsy to move. In a ragged, barely audible voice, Rob croaked, "Harold was with me last night, but he doesn't seem to be with me now." He was very weak. Then, obviously befuddled, he asked, "Was Harold with me? Can you tell me that?" I'd already reported with absolute certainty that I'd seen Harris on the south call at 6:30 p.m., May 10th. When Hall said that Harris was with him up on the south summit, 3,000 feet higher than where I said I'd seen him, most people, thanks to my error, wrongly assumed that Hall's statements were merely the incoherent ramblings of an exhausted, severely hypoxic man. By this point, Hall had possession of 2 full oxygen canisters, but the valves on his mask were so choked with ice that he couldn't get the gas to flow. He indicated, however, that he was attempting to de-ice the oxygen rig, which, says Cotter, made us all feel a little better. It was the first positive thing we'd heard. At 5 a.m., base camp patched through a call on the satellite telephone to Jan Arnold, Hall's wife, in Christchurch, New Zealand. She had climbed to the summit of Everest with Hall in 1993, and she entertained no illusions about the gravity of her husband's predicament. "My heart really sank when I heard his voice," she recalls. "He was slurring his words markedly. He sounded like Major Tom or something, like he was just floating away. I've been up there. I knew what it could be like in bad weather." Rob and I had talked about the impossibility of being rescued from the summit ridge. As he himself had put it, you might as well be on the moon. At 5:31, Hall took 4 milligrams of oral dexamethasone and indicated he was still trying to clear his oxygen mask of ice. Talking to base camp, he asked repeatedly about the condition of Mukalu Gao, Fisher, Beck Weathers, Yasuko Namba, and his other clients. He seemed most concerned about Andy Harris and kept inquiring about his whereabouts. Cotter says they tried to steer the discussion away from Harris, who in all likelihood was dead, because we didn't want Rob to have another reason for staying up there. At one point, Ed Viesters jumped on the radio from Camp 2 and fibbed, "Don't worry about Andy. He's down here with us." A little later, Mackenzie asked Rob how Hansen was doing. "Doug," Hall replied, "is gone." That was all he said, and it was the last mention he ever made of Hansen. On May 23rd, when David Breschers and Ed Viesters reached the summit, they would find no sign of Hansen's body. They did, however, find an ice axe planted about 50 vertical feet above the south summit, along a very exposed section of ridge where the fixed ropes came to an end. It's quite possible that Hall and/or Harris managed to get Hansen down the ropes to this point, only to have him lose his footing and fall 7,000 feet down a sheer southwest face, leaving his ice axe jammed into the ridge where he slipped. But this, too, is merely conjecture. What might have happened to Harris remains even harder to discern. Between Lopsang's testimony, Hall's radio calls, and the fact that another ice axe found on the south summit was positively identified as Andy's, we can be reasonably sure he was at the south summit with Hall on the night of May 10th. Beyond that, however, virtually nothing is known about how the young guide met his end. At 6 a.m., Cotter asked Hall if the sun had reached him yet. "Almost," Rob replied, which was good, because he'd mentioned a moment earlier that he was shaking uncontrollably in the awful cold. In conjunction with his earlier revelation that he was no longer able to walk, this had been very upsetting news to the people listening down below. Nevertheless, it was remarkable that Hall was even alive after spending a night without shelter or oxygen at 28,700 feet in hurricane-force winds and wind chill of 100 degrees below zero. During this same radio call, Hall asked after Harris yet again, "Did anyone see Harold last night except myself?" Some 3 hours later, Rob was still obsessing over Andy's whereabouts. At 8:43 a.m., he mused over the radio. "Some of Andy's gear is still here. I thought he must have gone ahead in the nighttime. Listen, can you account for him or not?" Wilton attempted to dodge the question, but Rob persisted in his line of inquiry. "Okay. I mean, his ice axe is here, and his jacket and things." "Rob," Viesters replied from Camp 2, "if you can put the jacket on, just use it. Keep going down and worry only about yourself. Everybody else is taking care of other people. Just get yourself down." After struggling for 4 hours to de-ice his mask, Hall finally got it to work, and by 9 a.m., he was breathing supplemental oxygen for the first time. By then, he'd spent more than 16 hours above 28,700 feet without gas. Thousands of feet below, his friends stepped up their efforts to cajole him to start down. "Rob, this is Helen at base camp," Wilton importuned, sounding as if she was on the brink of tears. "You think about that little baby of yours. You're going to see its face in a couple of months, so keep on going." Several times Hall announced he was preparing to descend, and at one point we were sure he'd finally left the south summit. At Camp 4, Lakbachiri and I shiver in the wind outside the tents, peering up at a tiny speck moving slowly down the upper southeast ridge. Convinced that it was Rob coming down at last, Lakba and I slapped each other on the back and cheered him on. But an hour later, my optimism was rudely extinguished when I noticed that the speck was still in the same place. It was actually nothing but a rock, just another altitude-induced hallucination. In truth, Rob had never even left the south summit.